Okay, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Welcome to this panel on nature as an afterthought, a debate about risk perception, urgency, and agency in an era of polycrisis. My name is Ina Lehmann. I'm based at the Institute for Environmental Studies, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And with me is my colleague Katie Minderhout from the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Together, we will moderate this session with a panel of eminent experts and hope to shed some light on the question around the role of nature in the current polycrisis and some ways to overcome this crisis and to make sure biodiversity gets the attention it deserves. The question for this panel is deliberately chosen to be somewhat provocative, but we believe there is a kernel of truth to the hypothesis that the loss and degradation of biodiversity do not get the public attention they deserve. And situating this observation in the theme for this conference, the era of polycrisis, oftentimes we may indeed not know where to look first with all the wars and catastrophes occurring at seemingly ever faster pace. And all of these crises make it to the headlines for good reasons. And yet, we may wonder why nature and biodiversity do not get the same level of attention. After all, we live in the times of the sixth mass extinction, the biggest extinction in Earth history since the disappearance of the dinosaurs. And this loss, however, is human-made. And it is already starting to affect human livelihoods and well-being around the world, and undermining vital ecosystem services and thereby livelihoods and well-being. And yes, the 2019 IPBES Global Assessment Report did raise a lot of attention to the biodiversity crisis. And since then, I would say that compared to 10, 12 years ago, we do have higher levels of attention to biodiversity. But still, saving species and ecosystems amongst the many crises that we have may sometimes still appear like a nice to have in the public discourse. And why, for instance, we can ask, is the UNFCCC COP29 in Baku, which will start on the 11th of November, already so much in the media headlines with CBD COP16, starting next week actually, is hardly visible in public discourse. So are the risks associated with biodiversity crisis not yet recognized widely enough? Whose perception of urgency and agencies is being taken seriously in the discussion about global biodiversity loss? And where does agency to change this come from? And finally, how do we better address the interdependencies of biodiversity crisis with other crises, notably the climate change and food crisis? This is what we want to explore in this panel in 3 steps. So first, together with our panelists, we will try to come to a more precise definition and understanding of the problem. Second, we want to move to discussing potential causes and root causes actually of the problem. And third, from there, moving to some positive solution-based outlooks. But before we delve into this, I will hand over to Katie to introduce the panel to you.
Thank you, Ina, for this introduction. And just to reiterate, we're very pleased that we have such a diversity of expertise and experience represented by each panelist to discuss this topic together. I would like to introduce each panelist with a few words to give insight in their current position, their background, and what they bring to the conversation. We are waiting for one panelist still to join, but I will introduce her just the same. Her name is Caroline van Leenders. She's based in the Netherlands and she works as a senior process manager, sustainable transitions for the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, Fisheries and Nature on international nature policy and specifically on finance for nature or green finance. Caroline's work is focused on accelerating the transition towards a nature-positive financial sector. And one of her key strengths is to bring people together and to enable coalitions to drive change while the actors themselves learn and change as they go. She has a wealth of experience working with the financial sector, which gives her unique insights, working at the intersection of different worlds, policy, science, and finance, and driving this change from within. And bringing also the how-to experience to policy discussions. So we're curious to hear from her what inspires her and what she feels needs to accelerate further in this field. Next, Shrishti Bajpai is joining us from Mumbai. She's an activist and a researcher and forms part of the Kalpa Environmental Action Group, which is a not-for-profit organization working on environmental and social issues at local, national, and global levels. Founded in 1979 and active in environmental awareness campaigns, litigation, and research. And I was drawn to the explanation around the name of where you work, Srishti, as a side note, but very telling as background information of the work you do. Because Kalpa comes from Indian mythology, and the name stands for a tree of imagination. It's a symbol for the nurturing qualities of nature and also stands for a proactive process that you can make happen what you desire. So the choice for the name of the organization was rooted in the strong belief of the value of indigenous knowledge as part of the answers for environmental issues in India. Srishti, her research focuses on documenting, researching, and networking on radical alternatives to dominant systems, with specific focus on exploring indigenous, traditional, and customary ways of living, decision-making, and their underlying worldviews. She has been researching and networking on the rights of nature movement with specific focus on South Asia and has helped found Rights of Rivers South Asia Alliance. Srishti, you shake us up by asking profound questions on the limitations of governance as we know it and show us new ways of looking at nature and to explore how to organize ourselves differently, which is exactly what we need to reimagine governance. Paul Berendt, originally from New Zealand, now based in the UK, is an author and a British Academy Global Professor at the University of Oxford, where he recently started in this position to research food systems. Paul leads interdisciplinary work on the impacts of human consumption with a focus on food, energy, water, economic, and climate systems. His academic track record reaches far beyond the circle of scientists because you have been able to reach a wide audience through different media outlets, and most notably with your book, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science, which explores what futures could look like and what is needed to steer towards a livable future. You're a passionate teacher and have worked as an energy consultant, policy advisor, and scientific commentator in the past. So apart from doing actual research yourself, you know what it takes to translate knowledge to practice for very different target groups. And in our introduction conversation for this panel, you also showed how your questions stretch the boundaries of systems thinking and which angles we can take to assess where we stand and where we want to go. Which is a much needed reflection in times of urgency. Last but not least, Tom Miwald works for Eco-Agricultural Partners, normally based in the US, but I think today in Switzerland. A not-for-profit, Eco-Agricultural Partners is a not-for-profit organization with a long track record in convening landscape partnerships and developing the knowledge base around landscape approaches. Currently, Tom is the director of the 1000 Landscape for 1 Billion People initiative, and his role is to coordinate and build alignment among the partners of this initiative to leverage their strengths and catalyze system transformation for regenerative landscapes. How I understand it is that you aim to make the tools and strategies for organizing landscape-level initiatives, to make those tools and strategies widely available, to make implementation possible and speed up at scale. Before your role at Eco-Agricultural Partners, you worked in government-led conservation programs in the US and you worked in different countries and geographies on land conservation and climate smart agriculture. So you bring rich experience on how to organize local partnerships and implementation on the ground in diverse contexts. So as I mentioned, it's a diverse panel. Ina set the stage in her opening remarks, and with these introductions, we roll out the red carpet for you, so to say. We start with an opening question to which each of you can respond in around 3 minutes, reflecting on the title of the session, Nature as an Afterthought. Where do you see nature in the polycrisis? How would you describe the place of nature in political and societal perception? So starting with that, I give the floor to Caroline in the order of introductions. If that's okay, welcome. I'm so glad that you managed to join. Can you take it away?
Well, thank you, Katie. Thank you for this invitation, for this super important question, because as we are starting to understand as people, there are many crises, and what we hope that we will have to start to understand is that they are all related. And that is the beauty of nature, because if one thing nature teaches is that everything is related. And that's maybe also the start of my my participation here is because everything is connected in nature, it can never be an afterthought. Because in very ways, if you everything is depending at the end of the day to nature. I mean, one of the things that I always get inspired by is the wedding cake of the SDGs. Of course, the SDGs are so important because they cover all the different areas of human life. But you can do a lot of cherry picking with the SDGs or with any goals. But if you put them together, if you relate them to one another, you can see that nature is the basis, as the European Central Bank also has shown that 75% of the economy of Europe is depending on ecosystem services or on nature and biodiversity. This is becoming a bit of a longer process where financials are starting to understand how important nature is. So also for business and finance, I've been working in that for 10 years now. Nature was not the first thought. Climate was first, but nature is catching up. And what nature teaches us is, as I said, that everything is related. And especially if you now look at the research that is coming up, not only hard research, but also studies done by all kind of financial organizations on the risks of biodiversity loss, which is not only related to species and butterflies, but it's related to us. And it shows it is already happening, how people are suffering because of biodiversity loss, and also that it's so related to climate. And I am so happy that more and more we begin to understand that these are not separate crises. These are crises that are related. So it's not maybe it's an afterthought, but it's not an after, but it's there. It has been there before us. So maybe the whole afterthought is more that we have to reconnect to the place, reconnect to nature, start to see connections instead of separations, start to look at what's really going on the ground instead of only modeling in economic sectors and BNP figures. So that's what I think. And if you really want to tackle any of these polycrises, you cannot do it without taking nature into account to bring prosperity again, to bring the food and the clean water that we all need, to bring the clean air that we breathe. That's needed in any crisis. So that would be my first thoughts.
Thanks, Caroline. Caroline for opening. Can I hand the floor to Shrishti?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Ina, and the team behind putting this panel together in this space. And thanks for the co-panelists to be here, and I'm really glad to be sharing the space with you all. So just building on to what Carolina was sharing, but also contemplating a little bit more on the question itself as to why we would frame a question nature as an afterthought. Because can nature really be an afterthought? It has always been here, and we are very much nature ourselves. And so why would we even ask that question? And we are right to ask that question because that's how it has come to be in the dominant systems and dominant discourses. But I want to center here the voices who are not actually putting this question or nature as an afterthought, but rather very much the center of their struggles and center of their resistance. And I'll give you one example from the community that I have been working with for over a few years, from central India, an Adivasi and indigenous peoples community. And I asked them a few years ago, one of their elders, as to why they were resisting against a mining project in their sacred territories. And he responded to me saying that, you ask, why do we oppose this mining project? And we can assume that all of us can be shifted to a city where we can find even homes for ourselves. But what will happen to the spirits in the forest? What will happen to the animals and the creatures who live in this forest? Where will they find their home? So for those communities who are struggling against destructive projects, who are struggling to protect their sacred forest and to protect their biodiversity, nature is not an afterthought. It is very much part of their discourses. It is very much part of how they even articulate what a community is. So for the indigenous elder that I was just speaking about, community is not just about the humans. It also includes the more than human world. It also includes the forest, trees, birds, animals, everything that lives around them. And so speaking up against destruction becomes speaking for the whole community, which includes the humans and the more than humans. I want to give another example also where I met late LaDonna Brave Bull, one of the earliest to protest the Dakota pipeline in North America. And when I was asking her of what was the inspiration of doing this resistance and protest, she said, when we cross the river, we pray to her and we have connection with the river. She's a living being, and water is the first medicine of the world. And so for a lot of communities in India, in African continent, in Australia, in New Zealand, in North America, Latin America, people are resisting. And for them, it's not an afterthought because these communities have lived and they have had systems of local governance which have informed people's interaction with fellow community members and rest of nature. And these communities who have living and thriving for many generations within these natural ecosystems have revered mountains, have revered rivers, forests, seas, and respecting them to have agency of their own. So in that sense, many of their systems of food, livelihoods, governance, culture, all have been so interconnected, as Carolina was also saying, because that's what life is truly about, that you find your sense of connection to the place that you live and connection to the environment that you live and structure your life around that. The crisis, the polycrisis that we face today is primarily the crisis of how we have completely separated ourselves from the place and the nature that we live around. And we know 100 other things, but not really the trees that are right outside our window. We will know 10 brands. And if we right now ask people around us and of 10 trees species that they could tell, we don't, because that's how disconnected we are from our landscapes and from our natural surroundings. So in that sense, many of these communities teach us of what really and give us important lessons of what really it is to live with the rhythms and moods of the natural world and grounding themselves into an intuitive, embodied knowledge of inhabited ecosystems. And I think for the communities, their struggle for autonomy, justice against continued neocolonialism, that's why all so tied together in struggle for biodiversity or protection of biodiversity and talking about nature. And that's what I think we seek inspiration from in terms of really looking at how for so many people, nature is not an afterthought and really at the center of their struggles and struggles for justice and alternative transformations. Yeah, thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Trishti. It's already a theme, like reconnect, but also reconnect to this knowledge and wisdom on how to live in different ways. Thank you for this opening statement. I pass it on to Paul, if you will.
Thanks very much, Katie. I should mention I'm from the UK, not to take on the. I would love to be a New Zealander, but very nice place to be from. Yeah, thanks for that, and thank you so much for organising. And really amazing first thoughts there. I'll focus in mostly on the UK and Europe, as where my experiences have been, and I think at a sort of macro level, in terms of a policy. In terms of a political and in terms of a sort of broad media perception, I think the title is exactly right. Nature and biodiversity is exactly an afterthought. For example, when you look at the upcoming COPs, I was speaking to a reporter from a major news agency the other day, and they said, yes, yeah, we're sending the whole team to climate, the climate COP. We know it's about finance, so we know it'd be, a little bit hard to get some interest and stuff, but we'll try our hardest, we'll get there. And unfortunately, we can't send anybody to the biodiversity COP. So this is the level on the media scale. And this is a reflection of, I think, the broader societal engagement as well in countries like ours across Europe. I think up until a few years ago, there wasn't even that. So at least we now have that. At least we have biodiversity COPs that are being, they did say, for example, that the reporter I was mentioning was saying we have some local reporters on the ground. We're just not sending the specialists. So we've got the regional reporters who will do it. So at least that's something. And yeah, I think another example that really sort of hit this home to me was I was speaking to an ex minister in the UK. I kept trying to hammer home the point that actually nature is in a dire state across Europe, that the UK is one of the most degraded countries on the planet. And if we want to walk the talk rather than saying that we're doing stuff, we need to do something about that. This was my impression. What I felt was that all the discussion was about the UK leading a coalition of the willing on these projects overseas, about charismatic fauna and, these sort of big splashy sort of names about, nature preservation. I mean, obviously, a lot of that will be worthwhile. I mean, it's important to do. But this idea of nature and biodiversity as a fabric and as part of the web of life, as history was just sort of, talking about so importantly, was completely missed. And so I think, until we start to see, and I think this will happen, I think it will actually become less and less of an afterthought over time, as you mentioned, at the start, and part of that is, the reliance of nature, the reliance that the climate change agreements have on nature-based solutions, for example. I mean, this is still a very operational utilitarian approach, but it will be necessarily drawn into things because things are happening at such a massive scale now, and the requirements for negative emissions are so incredibly massive in the COP process in IPCC reports that it will be very, very difficult not to start drawing in nature more and more. We can talk more and more about that as the session goes on.
Thanks, Paul. Hand over to you, Tom.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks so much for those opening comments. Thank you for the opportunity to talk in this session. I'll quickly provide some feedback and some perspectives from the United States, where I'm from. I'm from the Pacific Northwest in the United States. And so there was this brief time in the 1990s when biodiversity, this concept of species and biodiversity actually was not an afterthought. It came after a long period of extraction, but the species that nobody's ever seen before, the northern spotted owl, was a species that came to the forefront in a national dialogue about biodiversity. And it was really interesting because that, we hadn't really seen that before. And I think it's partly because as a country, we kind of hit that frontier stage. The Pacific Northwest was the Wild West frontier, and we hit it. We extracted all the old growth, and what was left were small little habitats. And the spotted owl became this poster child for biodiversity. And there was this brief time when people, there was conflict. There was definitely conflict where nature and biodiversity was not an afterthought, and it was the species that nobody's ever seen before. And what happened after that? I feel like there's a pattern that's forming of extraction. You get to the brink of species, extinction of things that people care about, and then people are like, wait a minute, let's do something. And kind of the solution that came up in the United States was this concept of looking at broader landscape scales through what we called ecosystem management at the time. So how do you look at broader scales, broader temporal and spatial scales? How do you bring in more people that work on the land? It's really a question about management of the land and what are the priorities within the landscape. And so I feel like that is a pattern that we're probably going to see in other places around the world, where we get to this brink, and as we in that 90s time, that the dialogue has moved away from, you don't hear about that anymore in the United States, and it goes towards, we talk a lot about the climate crisis. So as part of the Polycrisis, climate usually gets the largest amount of attention, I've noticed. So how do we bring biodiversity into that? I feel like the solution is through getting people together at a landscape scale, looking at the broader landscape, much like we did in the US, and thinking about how we can put natural areas within the perspective of mixed zones of agricultural use in urban areas, and start to think about how we can collaboratively start to plan for those parts of the landscape that are important for nature and biodiversity. And that way we can bring biodiversity and nature more closer in with the other priorities within a landscape. So I see the kind of a landscape approach as a poly solution to a polycrisis by bringing multiple things and partners together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And also for bringing explicitly in this point of at which scale level to look at these challenges in an interconnected and interdependent way. I hand over to Ina for the second part of our session, which aims to dig deeper in the problem as well as in the solution. Ina, I hand over to you.
Yes, thanks, Katie, and thanks to everybody for setting the scene. And I think it was nice to hear that there's already some, well, to some extent you agree, maybe biodiversity doesn't get the attention it should, but I think you also disagree about how bad it is in terms of it not getting attention, especially Carolina. I thank you for making a bit more of the point that, yes, it is catching up, whereas Paul, you very much emphasized how much it is still lagging behind. So let's take it from there and try to understand a bit more about what's actually the cause of the problem that at least biodiversity doesn't get enough of attention, whether it's catching up or not. And one thought that we had was about really the risk perceptions and the urgency of this topic. And people may perceive risks differently. People may perceive urgency differently. And I would actually like to play the ball to both Carolina and Paul first to maybe delve a bit deeper into what do you think, whose risk perception dominate, or whose vision of urgency do we see in this debate about the biodiversity crisis? Maybe Carolina, you want to start again?
Yeah, sure. Well, my work is with the private financial sector. That has been my work for the last few years. And what I see is that with the front runners. So that's only a part of the whole financial sector. There is the understanding that the biodiversity crisis might have more and higher financial risks than climate change. And because climate change and biodiversity loss are related, if you then start to combine the risk, they become kind of big, gigantic. So that is an understanding that's starting to set in. We have done a lot of work as a global community with the Taskforce on nature-related financial disclosures, where companies and financial institutions can start to understand the risks they face. This is not only important for the financial sector, but of course it's important for the economic, for the sectors they invest in. Because money is only something that we use for trade, but of course it's the real economy that has to change. So the understanding is catching up. That's not to say that the action is also catching up as fast, because as I said, also with climate change, you still see a lot of silo thinking, a lot of technological solutions, a lot of perverse effects also for biodiversity. Also with nature, if you start to plant forests, but you do it with only the same trees, you're not going to help biodiversity that much. So the whole process of learning that has to happen, capacity building, understanding your relationship to nature. If you look at the framework that the Taskforce for Nature-related Financial Disclosures launched last year, there is this process that you have to go through as company if you use their framework. It's called the LEAP process, and it's locate, evaluate, action, and commit. But it starts with location. And this is huge. The fact that companies and financials have to be aware of the location where they make their return, where they make their money. Is it close to the biodiversity sensitive hotspot? Are they using clean water that's also used by other communities and users? And what is their responsibility in using that water? So to go back to the place, to connect all your whole portfolio to a place, it's a gigantic operation, but it's needed to really be able to work with nature, because nature and biodiversity are different everywhere. And that's why we have been supportive of landscape finance. So great that Tom from Ecological Partners is here, because that's, I think, super important. I just learned a new word, not polycrisis, but a poly solution from him, the landscape approach as a poly solution. And I do think that that's really important. So the understanding of the risk is getting higher and higher on the agenda, is really in the boardrooms. There is a big movement to measure your impact and your dependencies as financials. But then the action to invest in a different way with a positive impact for biodiversity, or let's start with doing less harm, which already makes that's the phase we are now getting in, which is very, very new to them, because landscape investing asks cooperation with lots of stakeholders, which they may not be used to having contact with. So that will be my if you look worldwide, look at the world website of the TNFD, just get an understanding of what the real momentum is that is gathering there. COP16, we are going to COP16 next week. More financials than ever before. And they are not only there because Cali is the capital of salsa, but they are there because they know they have to start to take this on board in their work, biodiversity and nature. Yeah.
Thank you, Carolina. I think I try to summarize your contribution with what you said. I think it's a very catchy expression. The risk is in the boardroom. So, and I think this risk perception, you say, really drives also the business and finance community to, make nature be more than an afterthought again. Let's hear from Paul, because Paul, I think Carolina, you have your very in-depth knowledge of the finance system sector. So maybe, Paul, you take a bit of a broader view And maybe you can situate this comment of Caroline into, say, a more systems perspective on whose perceptions of risk and urgency dominate the debate or lack of debate or something in between when it comes to biodiversity.
Yeah, thanks, Ina. And maybe I did come across a bit negative in my open comments. I mean, there are things happening in the UK. I mean, the biodiversity net gain it's just started. This is the idea where you can buy offsets if you have sort of house developments. There are environmental land management schemes, but coming to this point of this sort of why we're not getting the attention needed in policy and practice. I think a large scale, a large part of it is, shifting baselines, of course, people's appreciation, public's appreciation, understanding, some of the sort of coming and going of media attention, as Thomas was talking about there, in terms of what actually attracts public attention. I think that there's also a danger that we continue to buy into something called the bucolic myth, that landscapes, especially in the UK and across Europe, need to look like these green pastures. This is somehow natural. This is somehow biodiverse. This is somehow a habitat that has large amounts of species on it. Whereas actually these environments are driving the largest part of biodiversity loss across Europe over the long term, but also massively in other countries due to deforestation. So our actual conceptions of what a natural environment to go take a walk in is quite heavily perverted. And that's perverted not only because some of these have heritage values, okay, so people have seen this maybe for 100 years in the case of some forms of farming in the UK, and so they think that this is somehow part of tradition. So therefore it must be more natural, which is not an equivalent. But also because these are heavily defended by industry interests, quite frankly. The idea that these areas are natural, that the massive amount of land that we use, especially for animal agriculture, so we use about almost half of all habitable land for agriculture across the world, and 80% of that is for animal agriculture. And there's been this long campaign over many, many years that animal agriculture is this sort of natural way of producing food. And nothing could be further from the truth. And so when we look at the appreciations and the difficulties, you can see why that's hard. We're constantly being advertised at that. And in terms of when it comes to risk, I'd say the other big people shouldering the risk of course, local communities, and often the poorest among society. Often we know, for example, around many areas of the world, in high-income nations, for example, the poorest in society have the most limited access to green space. They're more exposed to the air pollutants that you get when you don't have nature to buffer some of the excesses of pollution. And also it's the poor that are in regions which suffer the most when you don't have good amounts of diverse nature and biodiversity. For example, in flooding plains, for example, buying in flooding plains or not having access to flood insurance, that's actually a direct consequence of not having nature around us that is helping us out, buffer us, rolling with the punches of climate change. And so I think, there's the experience of the on-the-ground risks, I think often are among the poorest of society, and also among sort of the local communities who are also able to see some of the impacts of biodiversity loss.
Thank you, Paul, for putting also the focus squarely on the risk borne by those who are, say, the most marginalized in society. I think we also want to take it to discussing, whose risk perception, actually, perception of biodiversity, risk dominate this whole debate or lack of debate or lack of attention to the topic. And maybe, Shrishti, you want to come in there because you've also worked a lot with the most marginalized. How are their views of biodiversity? How are their views of the threats of biodiversity loss and their views of nature taken up in the public discourse? And what does this have to do with the question of whether or not biodiversity gets enough attention?
Thanks, Ina. I think the point that Paul made is such an essential point, that who is at the risk of when we don't talk enough about biodiversity. And also Thomas was making this important point that climate is looked or given more attention to in comparison to biodiversity. And I feel the root of all of this is the very problematic aspect of how we even look at climate and biodiversity, as if they are two separate entities, as if we have, I think it's a lack of knowledge and understanding of what nature is. And that's exactly what local communities and marginalized communities and indigenous people across the world have been articulating, that you cannot separate the two. They're actually very interlinked. And so that's why climate solutions that we have been seeing over the last few years are so actually in many ways anti-nature. For example, to control control carbon, there are proposals, at least here in the Indian context, proposals to do monoplantations and clear very old forest to actually just do monoplantations, and that is being sold to communities as ways to capture carbon. So in a sense, these solutions that are coming up are also then from a very technical point of view, from a very reductionist point of view, that doesn't really understand how nature works, and it's not even willing to understand, because that's not where the money can be made, because all of these climate solutions coming from the sense of utmost urgency to solve problems is coming from lack of knowledge and lack of respect of indigenous people and other local communities understanding of nature also. And in many ways not even bringing in the views of scientists, people, biologists, people who have been doing it from a very scientific point of view as well, bringing in important elements to this whole debate, but not really looking at these basic understandings. So in a sense, just to move towards a more conclusion, to also bring in the elements of what is happening around, of how nature is viewed in itself. These many worldviews that I was talking about earlier as well, they have been challenging this dominant strand of Western thinking. And right now, most of the climate debates, even biodiversity debates, so to say, even at COP, which is getting less attention, but a lot of these debates are still in the dominant strands of Western thinking, like humans alone have possessed the rights, and they control the living world, so we can come up with all the solutions that we have. And not really respecting a lot of global South countries. And so there is also the dynamics there, but even global South within global North, and there are dynamics of course, global North within global South as well. So much of the solution, much of the responses are from a very reductionist, modernist perspective, where people's way of doing thing or indigenous people's knowledge and all of those are actually looked or appear to be either feel good things or normally taken as a little nonsense that you can just keep on the side. But that's actually where things need to change, and many of these struggles of territorial defense that we're seeing across the world are challenging these ways of thinking, these fundamental ways of cognitive differences that exist. And they're articulating this understanding of humans as not being atomized individual cells to actually being connected to more than communities, and bringing in these perceptions, these worldviews as part of these new debates. And I feel these frameworks of Earth jurisprudence, rights of nature, more than human rights, wild law, ecofeminism, eco-socialism, all of these things that are merging at the heart of the empire in that sense, are signaling those radical shifts, are talking about how do we shift from an extractive mind to really recognizing nature as having rights or as a source of human laws and how we govern ourselves. So I think that's where some changes are happening, but the risk and whose risk it is and who is losing is still, as I think my co-panelists have also highlighted well enough, is still very centered at the power centers and communities there.
Thank you, Srishti. And I think these were really important additions. And you were talking about especially like the detachment and the quick fix solutions as one of the causes also of why we are maybe taking biodiversity not seriously enough. I want to connect this to also moving slowly from problem diagnosis to solution, but maybe still somewhere in between. Want to connect this to what Tom said earlier about landscapes being the poly solutions. And I wonder, Tom, whether you would want to comment on what Srishti said about our disconnect from nature, about the Western quick fix solutions that are being propagated. Are landscapes the solution to these problems of disconnect and not respecting nature enough?
And in my mind, it's about thinking at broader spatial scales, the spatial scales that biodiversity, that animals exist in. They don't exist in small patches. They exist across landscapes. And right now, you know, in most of the developed world, we have a lot of small patches of what we might call nature. Getting to Paul's concept, what is nature in the first place? There's so many ways to kind of crack that. What is a pristine habitat for biodiversity? It depends on a lot of different aspects of the condition of the size of those patches, and then we have to think about the connectivity between those patches in order for genetic, you know, getting at the very biology of species, just general patterns in the landscape that you have to maintain biodiversity. And that is where I feel like we have to have that landscape perspective. You can't think about the world in one patch, one farm, one area at a time. And it can't be a top-down approach either. That tends to be where we go. There's a lot of protected areas. Protected areas is always a kind of the go-to, has been like, let's protect this area. And right now, all the protected areas are in montane areas. They're in glaciers. They're in places that you are difficult to get to. In Alaska, for example, there's a lot of just pristine nature and biodiversity. It's right now there, you know, the Pebble Mine was another kind of recent thing that came into the mindset of America and probably Canada too, about salmon and the mine. So there was this conflict, and for now it looks like the salmon are and the indigenous voices and the local voices and the global voices for salmon are winning that. And that's a landscape aspect too. So I think you have to look at biodiversity within temporal and spatial scales that are representative of this framework or this land configuration that will support as much biodiversity as possible. There's a lot of things that, of course, will, you know, like I said, that the room with 8 billion people on Earth to now create new protected areas for species is dwindling. I don't know if there is much room left for big protected areas, maybe in some places. But so we have to start to think about how can we coexist with agriculture, with protected areas, with urban areas. I see designing nature and developing a collaborative design for nature is really the only solution in these areas where we have some nature left. We have these mixed zones of agriculture, and then we have urban areas. So I think you need to have that perspective. Common lands for returns framework is a great solution, and integrated landscape management from that we work with, and the 1,000 landscapes. We see this as a process and a practice that we hope local communities can develop the skills to do that on their own. So it's not a top-down approach; it's a bottoms-up approach to find that there's always going to be conflict, but if you can start to find those configurations in the landscape that promote biodiversity, I think that's what we're looking for.
Ina, shall I pick up from here? Because indeed, this was a nice bridge also towards thinking more about solutions. What can we do? And we, I think, Tom, you present really well how this is a practice and a process, and primarily place-based, which also puts forward this question which we have for this last section of the panel discussion. Where should agency come from? So where will agency come from, especially in a time where we see polarization, and also so we see a conflict on very different themes in society. But so, for example, also in the Netherlands, the farmers' movement, backlash also to nature policy and nature goals that the Netherlands has. So instead of what we would like to see, where there are opportunities to merge goals and look for different models in the public debate and how it is understood, these conflicts really come to the fore. So we would like to ask you, and I think this is now also very rich because we've heard so much from you, but to think about this question, like where can the agency come from? And then I want to pass it back to Srishti for the first one. How do we give room to the perceptions of value, risk, and urgency, and specifically thinking of those at the front lines of biodiversity loss who are fighting these battles in specific places? But I want to broaden it up also a little bit, like how can we create the safe space where these different value perspectives are truly heard and represented? I think you put it like it's not a little bit of knowledge on the side because it touches to the core of how we need to look differently. But how do you see that connect to agency and also in facilitating spaces in policy for or other spaces? What do you see as a road forward?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's a very important question, and I'll try answering it to the best of my capacity based on the experiences that we have. But of course, it will be limited because there's so much work to be done in this element of how do we really make safe spaces for different voices to be in the same room. One, I feel what you were just giving as an example of what's happening in Netherlands with farmers and communities and the voice for nature and doing things for conservation and protection of nature. I think those conflicting views and struggles exist based on, of course, the context and where we are everywhere. And I feel that we need to have a good framework to look at some of these issues more intersectionally. And in a sense that we have to keep justice as one value of being able to look at these issues. Justice is just one value, but there are so many values that connect many of our contexts together. There's justice, there's autonomy, there's direct democracy, there's economy of care and share, just to illustrate a few. But these should be at the heart of when we are taking decisions, or at least coming together in a room. That even if you're divided by context, or even if you're divided by certain solutions and understanding, there is a common understanding of values and principles that brings us together, a common value of respect for nature, and we're really wanting and yearning to do something about it. So maybe one of us has an idea about doing it through what Carolina was saying, shifting systems in finance. And some of us feel that, working with the communities can really change those systems. But how can we hold those values together? But now the values, if they're contrasting, completely different of, how can we exploit more and respect for nature, sitting in the room together, that would always be a hard battle to overcome. And I think that's where the struggle right now is. But in general, of how do we make sure that, especially even in our own circles, even in our own networks, how do we ensure that the voices and perceptions of people who are most marginalized are there, is simply making room for them. Even now in most of the COPs, it's beginning to change, but communities are on the corridors of power. They're not really sitting and making those decisions. They're not part of it. And I think it's really important to make space for that. There's a new movement emerging of making space or a seat for nature in the room and whatnot. So those spaces, those ways of looking at decision making in a different way is really important. And continuously also creating spaces of decolonizing ourselves. So what does that really then mean? And how do we do that in our everyday practice? And what it would look like. And I think Thomas points of landscape, some people have used the idea of bioregionalism, and communities have always also, in many of their traditional practices, have had territorial management of landscapes. So those kind of practices of governance and managing of landscape, conservation of landscapes should be understood because they're really interconnected. They have governance, economy, ecology, culture, all interplaying with each other. So I feel that we also need to be closer to the ground, to the grassroots, where a lot of these churnings have happened, not for a few hundred years, but thousands of years. So we really need to begin listening to those voices and drawing out lessons that really are needed for these times. And of course, the logistics of, providing support, funding, and all of that is also there. And I think that works only when we are closer to the ground and, really, truly, deeply listening to what's happening and what people are facing, and finding our sense of responsibility in these times, each one of us, but also as collectives and movements who are interested to change things. Yeah, for now, that's it, Katie. Over to you.
Thanks, Trishti. It's also, at least what resonates a lot with me is that that how we pay attention to how we convene and how we facilitate in having this shared value perspective, or a process in which we explore which values are underlying, because the focus is always so much on more the knowledge, like how do we understand it, but what are the layers beneath that we're not uncovering. And I want to ask Paul, maybe if you can reflect from your work more in the scientific domain, but also, of course, making the bridge to societal debate, but how do you see that challenge of bringing in these plural value perspectives, or how should it connect to the scientific work? I hope that makes sense. Like, can you reflect from your position on this question?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, that's a very, very big question. Because science, you can investigate the ways in which we are harming the planet, the ways in which we can change to improve nature, to improve biodiversity. But the values as to how that actually rolls out in the real world is obviously highly political. And I guess as time has gone on, what I've seen more and more, though, is that the science itself becomes very politicized. And so a lot of the recent experiences that I have had has been trying to address the misrepresentations of science from interested parties, or parties that may have had sort of interests involved in their work. So one example recently is that the Food and Agricultural Organization presented a paper, a report that underestimated the role that dietary change could have in addressing emissions from livestock. Of course, that's a massive biodiversity question as well, as we just talked about. So when we talk about polysolutions, this is why I focus so much on the food system and in general on animal agriculture, especially in high-income nations. Is because I see it as the largest lever that we have, and the science shows that that's the largest lever that we have in high-income countries. But of course, that is directly set up against some very large interests. And so the different values that then feed into that. I mean, Carolina, it would talk about some of the Dutch farming experiences, of course, as well. And so it's an incredibly complicated web of different interests and the ways in which different levels of people operating at different scales, from the farmer to the unions of farmers to the representatives at the European Commission, for example, to take the Dutch example. and how all of those are related. And so the question is, like, how does science fit within that? And so you're basically trying to defend the scientific consensus within that, whilst allowing for the nuance that there are different values around what that particular future might look like. So not saying that there's this specific vision as a scientist that, you know, I desperately want to see. As an individual, I may have an idea of what I want to see, but, like, you know, there are many different versions of that vision under a situation where we have much healthier diets for the planet and people, and that will include a much deeper reduction in animal agriculture with massive ramifications for biodiversity. That's not really talking directly to nature, but it's such a large part that, sorry, that I had to just focus on food there for so much.
No, thanks, Paul. I think that also what it makes really clear is also, like, there's the physical reality of our world with spatial scales in the environment, but the governance world cuts across sectors and actors and different levels. So I want to connect this back to Tom, because how do you see the poly solution of the landscape approach, like, that grounds it to the local context, but can you say something how you see it connect to these larger system perspectives, like how the food systems should change in terms of agency? Because my understanding of the landscape approach, that it's about organizing the collective action in the landscape. At the same time, you also have an important role or potential agency to contribute to this systemic change, right? I'm just curious how you see that, and also what do you feel is needed to make that connection more explicit? Is it also something that can empower landscape initiatives to pick up their role more? Do you go ahead?
Yeah, no, I mean, okay, so, you know, when I talk about landscape approaches, it sounds like, oh yeah, that's going to be easy. No, in no world is a landscape approach necessarily a easy or a difficult thing. It's a process, like I was saying, and to do that, to make that process work, you need financial and technical assistance facilities to promote landscape partnerships, to have a coordinator to work to develop the partnership, to bring people together, convene, develop a plan, and then finance the plan. And the role of there's a great initiative that we're working with called Regen 10, where they're trying to develop regenerative agricultural practices and a framework for looking at outcomes for regenerative landscapes. So looking at the farm level and the landscape level, how can we then start to map and monitor over time these changes within food systems? So food systems are very much part of the landscape. To kind of take a step back, and Common Land has come up with this zones perspective, where we have to think about the world in the landscape in zones. And there's the natural zone. Of course, that is where we would be focusing on biodiversity. There's the urban zone, which is, you know, very focused on people. And then there's this mixed zone where there's agricultural fields and there's spatial patterns that represent agriculture. And in there are patterns that could represent biodiversity too, and riparian zones and connectivity corridors. One of the most important things you can do in terms of climate change for climate change resilience planning for biodiversity is to develop connectivity zones between natural habitats, because we need to have that movement for species and biodiversity across the landscape. And that could happen in that mixed zone of agriculture. So how do you know, we don't want to take agricultural land out of production per se, but how do we develop a landscape that's permeable for species to move, that's protected at some level, and then promote that biodiversity movement across the landscape? I feel like there's a solution in there. It's not easy, and it takes time, and it takes bringing people together. There's no one organization, there's no one agency that is in charge of developing conservation corridors. So you have to bring people together, and they have to find their place in the landscape and what they can do to promote that kind of biodiversity. But you have to make people feel like that's a value of theirs too. I know in the Pacific Northwest and the landscape partnerships that I was involved with, yes, we came in from a very conservation perspective. Let's make connectivity zones in the Pacific Northwest forests, and that resonates with absolutely nobody in terms of landowners. It resonates with people and agencies and NGOs. So how do you make that resonate with landowners in a way that they're compelled to do something at a landscape level? And there's, they want to maintain working lands for themselves as well. So there are, there's a middle ground. It doesn't have to be the conflict of the spotted owl that I brought up earlier. There are ways that we can collectively develop solutions to the biodiversity crisis.
Thanks, Tom. Carolina, not to put you on the spot, but I was curious, like thinking more about this solutions, the way forward, the work you are doing with financial sector. You're paving the way for how finance can play a different role. Can you share your last reflections on where you feel the most pressing piece of the puzzle is now to take steps in the right direction? Either like on making finance available for more intangible work in landscape processes, or how can multiple values be better represented in financial accounting? Where do you see that the most important shift or opportunity lies?
Well, Katie, thank you for putting me on the spot. That's why I'm here. Well, I think that a lot of the work that I see in the forefront resonates with everything that's being said by the other panelists. I was in a big meeting, and suddenly somebody with all kind of financial experts, and suddenly somebody said, what is a really interesting program is run by the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. I thought, hey, that's my organization, and it's called Reversing the Flow. And it's a program where they try to work on locally led development and also on locally led financing. And the idea is to reverse the flow of finance. And I think that that's part of the system change that we need. A lot of finance is top down, from global to local. But a lot of people, even all kind of international organizations, World Bank, IMF, you name them, they are finding out it's not easy to get the money on the ground to the right people. One of the things that is really important in finance is that because nature doesn't have a price, it's not easy to get a good investment case. So we published a paper on blended finance for nature, and blended finance is combining different kind of financial streams. Can be public, but it can also be philanthropic, with different private financial streams that ask a return, little bit like impact investors, or maybe a little bit more. If you combine these financial streams, you can get to an investment case for nature. And in this paper, we said you need regional blended financing facilities that have the capacity to bring together the different financial streams, but also to bring together the different projects that have to be financed in a region, in a landscape. And in this facility, you have to make sure that all kind of stakeholders have a say. Youth, young people, what do we invest in for our future? Women, indigenous communities, also local businesses, and also local financial institutions. So this idea about capacity building and facilities or structures for blended finance for nature is one of the things that we will also discuss in Cali. We have some side events. It's also on the agenda because it's one of the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And in this blended finance thinking, if you make it regional, you can also try to work on reversing the flow and making sure that it's not only that money goes in the right direction, but that also the people that are there, the communities on the ground, that restore the biodiversity or look after our ecosystems and their services, that they have a say in how to invest the money. So I think that this is one of the ways forward where we can maybe combine lots of the landscape work that has been done the last 10 years with the need for nature, with the need for different kind of financing, financial streams, because in the paper that was in the research that was done, there are 23 examples blended finance for nature, and the researchers have talked to a lot of people of the OECD, you name it, and one thing was clear: blended finance for nature only works when you have really good connections with the people and the communities on the ground. If you don't have that connection, then there is a big possibility that your project, that your investment will fail. So again, nature makes you have to look at the place, at the region, at the landscape, and maybe this kind of thinking is an opportunity not only to do justice and work with nature, but also work with the local communities, because we are all part of nature. Yeah, so that would be one of the things I see, and I've been organizing the Interface Dialogue Finance and Biodiversity, difficult name, but we have a website. We did a special webinar on locally led financing, with landscape finance, with reversing the flow, with different best practices. So you can find all the information on the website. But I think that this is a really paradigm shift from reversing the flow.
Thanks, Caroline. And also really really strong point that you make about, because it points to the capacity and also the legitimacy of local intervention, so that it's a condition for finance to do what it wants to do, or all the plans, etc. If it's not grounded literally in place, but also in relationships and people, nothing will fly. Yeah, and maybe it's also a question about making these key points much more prominent, that it's one of the conditions, but it's so fundamental and important, and to raise the awareness around that. But I know you're doing lots of work, but also reiterating it for myself, that how these conditions overlap and make bridges.
Yeah, well, I always say the strength of nature is that it's local, because a lot of people start to complain. You know, if you work on climate, you have one indicator. I always say you have one global ecosystem, our atmosphere and our ocean. So they have to do with CO2. The rest is local, and then people say it's so complicated. Or it's a big advantage. The big advantage of nature is that it's different everywhere, and people are also different everywhere. So it's advantage, because you have to go back to the place. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. No, thank you. We are entering into the Q&A section, so I'm handing over back to Ina. Go ahead, Ina.
Yes, precisely. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody, for your engaged discussion so far. I really want to encourage our audience. You have the Q&A box in your Zoom window where you can put your questions for the speakers, and we will raise them to the speakers. If you want to, you can also raise your hand and we can make you a panelist, and you can also speak up and comment directly. Whatever you prefer, but really please feel invited to ask your questions to the panelists, or share your comments and your thoughts about the topic. And I see there are so far no questions in the chat box. So to give you some time to think about what you may want to ask, maybe I will ask one more question to the panelists, and that's actually, is there any question you want to ask to any of your fellow panel members? Because we have been asking you a couple of questions. You have been giving answers. Some of them are aligned, some of them are maybe not so much aligned, and definitely you do come from different perspectives. So this is also your chance. If anybody of you has a question for one of your fellow panelists, please raise them now. If not, is there anything you think was missing in the debate so far that you would still want to raise, considering the questions we have raised and maybe the questions we have not asked? I see people are joining the panel, but I still don't see any raised hands or... Oh, Paul, yes, you want to raise something. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add on to what Carolina was saying there about this local, what you see at the local level, and this sort of slightly what's in it for me sort of idea of what you know, people in their busy lives, how do you get them to engage and realize the massive amount of what's at stake? And I think, you know, this landscape and land is a really clear one that's just so important, and we can tell a really, really wonderful story about cleaner air, cleaner water, more recreation near us, more green spaces near us, you know, more nature. There is a really wonderful story to be told, and that story has to be told over and over and over again at very local levels. I think that story, you know, can also include how we adapt to how the impacts of environmental crises are hitting us. So, you know, in the UK recently, we had quite a lot of floods. We had flooding across large areas of the country. And, you know, one of the stories that you can tell there is that, you know, biodiversity will help us deal with this. You know, it doesn't, yes, it's scary. Yes, you know, it can feel like it's too much. But actually, if we do the things that we know we need to do across our landscapes for nature, it will actually also allow us to respond to these experiences that we have. So getting as close as possible to the experiences of individuals, you know, I'm talking mostly in high income nations here, in general, and, you know, obviously, you know, set in terms of like people in urban areas, for example. But I did actually have a question for Shistri. I just wanted to ask you, Shistri, is there any areas of academic work, of scientific work, that has been sort of particularly helpful in your work, or are there areas that you think are being missed that should be focused on in research?
Thanks, Paul. Well, in terms of a lot of research on biodiversity in these areas that are threatened is very limited. Not because that people don't know the value of these forests, but somehow not enough scientific research is done to actually back it up to say that the protection of these traditional forests or protection of these landscapes has been actually scientifically improving the quality of environment or climate, or I mean those kinds of indicators. And so somehow the solutions that then get offered through climate lobby come to acquire more precedence, or come to acquire more prominence than the others, because they have more scientific backing and scientific papers to back that up. So I guess for communities, it would be really helpful if their own traditional practices get connected with scientific knowledge as well, because that's when the strength comes of different knowledges coming together. So they, of course, have their own way of understanding and science of it. It is also scientific in its own ways, but that coming together doesn't really happen. So a biologist sitting in a science lab in, say, Mumbai wouldn't go to a community living in the, central India far off. So that connection doesn't happen. So I guess that is where research is required a lot to make those connections happen. And the second area of research is also, which is connected to the first, is how people have actually politically and at governance level manage these ecosystems. And only beginning to now we see that what really governance can mean if we look at some of these practices. There are some things happening that would be more social sciences, anthropological research, but it needs more scholar, activist research and talking about it more. Is beginning to happen, especially in some rights of nature or jurisprudence kind of stuff, but still very limited, very few people doing that. Yeah. Thanks for asking, Paul.
Thanks for explaining, Shishti, and I think this answer is probably of interest to a lot of us, at least those joining from the academic sphere. Thanks, that was super interesting. And in that sense, also really thanks, Paul, for raising that question. I see Carolina has raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to share that I work together with the Foundation for Sustainable Development. They host the ecosystem evaluation database, which is a database with the monetary value of ecosystem services, which is different all over the world. It's a scientifically filled database. So there's this ecosystem partnership, which is a group of scientists worldwide working on ecosystems. And every time a scientist somewhere in the world does a scientific research into the monetary value of ecosystem services, what would the bees be worth if we would not be here, stuff like that. What would these dunes be worth if they would be eroded and we have to build a dike, that kind of stuff. So if those kind of, then it gets into the database. This monetary value of ecosystem services, there are 6,000 data points from all over the world. So maybe it would be of interest to see if there's data on ecosystem services in some of the projects that some of the other panelists are involved in. And there is a report, Make Nature Count, which is a study done by the ASN Bank with this data. So if you have land change, you go from a degraded land to agriculture or to a forest. What kind of value of ecosystem services? How is the value of ecosystem services changing? And also value for who? Because a lot of time the value of ecosystem services like wood or food, they go to the private sector. But if there's a decrease in the ecosystem values for clean air, because the trees are being chopped, then it's the community that pays for the degrees of the value of that service. So this is super interesting scientific work to include into looking at the future in when you have different uses for land. And I would really, if you like scientific work, and there's a big European community, it's called Selina, which are all the scientists working on ecosystem services, which is of course about people, because it's services to us. So it's always related to people and communities, services to whom. So I think that would be maybe an interesting scientific addition to some of the work being done in this space.
Thanks for sharing, Carolina. I saw many people took notes, and I see there, so I guess this is well taken, and I see there is indeed one hand from the floor. Mohammed, please go ahead. And introduce yourself if you want to. Mohammed, unfortunately, oh yeah, there you are. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for giving the floor. I thank you for organizing an insightful debate based on the management of ecosystem. I am Mohamed Munir from Demboumier. I am speaking from Cameroon. I am an ecological practitioner. So my question revolves around water and land conservation in the context in a mountain ecosystem where agriculture is the main activity. So we are faced in a situation where we have agriculture, we have breeders, and we are also struggling to conserve biodiversity in an area. But just that all these factors are conditioned by water, especially in the dry season where water becomes a scarce resource. So I am about to ask, how can we do to benefit these water resources in a degraded mountain fragile ecosystem where the population rely on agriculture for their subsistence and also for income, and also where breeders mostly nomads, walk from the mountain down to the valley to search for greener pasture in the dry season. My question is, how can we do to merge all these in a landscape milieu? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. That's a very important question, of course, about also the interconnection between environmental problems and water and biodiversity. Does any of the panelists want to address this question?
I mean, I could say a few words. I mean, this is a complex topic of how to manage all of that within a landscape setting. I would just point to some of the tools and resources that we have on our 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People website, just to make a plug for the tools that we have out there. Just that are designed specifically for things like this, for looking at landscape jurisdictions and how you bring people together and different stakeholders that represent different parts of the interest of the landscape and bring them together to develop an integrated landscape management plan. Not to get too jargony there, but I think that's kind of what I feel it would be really useful if you checked out some of the tools on landscapes.global.
Thank you, Tom. Also another important hint at another important database. Are there any other questions from the audience or comments? If that is not the case, I think we are 3 minutes close to closing, so I think we can slowly wrap it up. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Katie as my co-moderator, and of course the amazing ESG team for setting up and helping us with all the technicalities. I think we've covered a lot of ground. What I take from this is that there's a lot of things going on. Still, biodiversity definitely isn't there. We've heard from Paul about how many journalists are going to the UNFCCC COP and how many COP are going to the CBD COP. In any case, the CBD COP is taking place next week, so maybe we also raise some interest among some of the audience here to follow that COP. For me, I think political will still is one of the key scarce resources that we need to address, because we have a lot of movement in the finance sector. We have a lot of education going on. We've heard a lot about what's needed in terms of bringing the understanding of the importance of value to the people. But I think we definitely also need to bring this more into the political decision-making sphere. I want to ask all panelists whether they want to have a 1-minute closing statement to share with us their main takeaways, and then we can all continue with our days, or those of you who are sitting more in the Asia region, maybe have a good evening. Maybe let's go by the order that I see here. Tom, do you want to give a 30 seconds closing statement?
Thanks so much for this opportunity. It's great to hear the different voices out there. I felt like we agreed more than we disagreed on most things. I think we kind of came to the conclusion, yes, it is an afterthought. Nature tends to be an afterthought until it's almost like what I was saying, until it's almost too late, then people get together and say, hey, let's make a plan and do something different. And so that's where I feel like the landscape approach is part of the solution to the polycrisis. And and thank you for your debate.
Thank you, Tom. Paul, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, just picking up that almost too late point. There will never be a point at which it's not worth pushing everything that we can towards this. And as things change, it will open up more and more opportunities. And I do think that we will start to experience types of feedbacks where, as people make changes to food systems, to health systems, as we know, we make the change, we have to make the changes that we know we need to make. It will encourage us to do even more, because it will make so much of a bigger difference to people's lives and experiences. a little bit of note of optimism I hope at the end of that. But I think we do need a greater integration. And I'll put in the link, actually, a letter that was written by my colleague, Natalie Pettarelli, to ask for a joint work program between the new UNFCCC and the CBD to actually sort of start aligning biodiversity and climate goals and get a better platform for biodiversity. I'll put down the link now.
Thank you, Paul. Indeed, a very important one, and I think it already has a lot of signatures. So, but of course, more is needed, especially as the COP is coming along, because I've also heard from the organizers of this letter that they really want to approach delegations, and the more people have signed this, the better, obviously. Kirsty, very short closing remarks.
Well, thank you for organizing this conversation. I learned a lot from my co-panelists, and lots of gratitude. Thank you.
That was short and sweet. Carolina, any final words from you?
Yeah, well, money makes the world go round. So I would encourage you all to not be afraid, and don't say it's not my comfort zone, but please reach out to the financial sector, because they can only spend their money once. They don't want to do it on climate or biodiversity. They want to find investments that serves all crises, both crises. They're also calling for more cooperation between the climate COPs and the biodiversity COPs. The front runners are. So see the front runners as your allies. That would be a call that I would like to make. And if you think you have to reduce complexity, take a regional approach or a landscape approach. It reduces complexity enormously. And take then biodiversity and then water and soil as your starting point to think about what is a coherent region, because a lot of time nature has connections with culture. So within a landscape, if you define it based on natural borders, you find lots of times that also the culture of people in that landscape has its own, such a landscape has its own culture. So that would be my final call.
Thank you, Carolina. And I think with that, you've really taken us from the polycrisis to polysolutions. So I think that was a very nice ending. Thank you all. Thank you on behalf of Katie and me. And I think we can close the webinar formally now. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Like, can we stop the recording?